Glad to see you all. All right, so let me see how we're doing for time. Yeah, 2 minutes. We'll get started in 2 minutes. Thank you, thank you, thank you, you guys. All righty, hi everybody. Glad to see you. Hope you are all doing great. If we have some folks hop in just a little bit, we will welcome them and have them join. So happy to see you. Hope you had a good holiday break. So will you think for a minute on this slide, and we are always learning something new. Maybe it's something we're learning in our profession. Maybe it's something we are learning in our own life. Maybe we have started some new classes, started some new lessons, doing some reading. So will you type into the computer, into the chat box, what is something that you are learning that is new in your life? Please type into the chat box something new that you are learning in your life. If they're all righty, can you hear me, everybody? Here we go. Okay, great. Oh, interesting. Thanks, Morland. Dyslexia can be identified at a very early age. I love that. Oh, that's cool, Carl. How to use a wood lathe. I would love to learn that. I would love to learn how to use a lathe. We had a helpful dyslexia training on Friday. Oh, good. Oh, I'm so glad. That's very exciting. How awesome is that? So for those of you who just joined, will you please type something into the chat box? I love that. Amy, are you studying that somehow? Or are you just learning it on your own, practicing? Love it. For those of you who just joined, we're typing in something we are learning to do in our life. Learning how to draw basic flowers. Oh, that's cool, Rose. I love that. How fun. Just practicing. Yeah, that's good, Amy. Very nice. I'll give it a minute or two. Love the sharing so far. Thank you, everybody who shared so far. All right, I'll give it about 10 more seconds. Thank you to those who wrote in. That's very fun. Thank you so much. Very good. All right, let's get started. So today's work is about assessing vocabulary and increasing our expertise on how we might use a set of vocabulary activities as an assessment. So vocabulary is a very tricky thing to assess, and there are some tricky dilemmas with it. And so we have to be mindful about how we're going to assess vocabulary, and depending on the way we're assessing that vocabulary, what does that data really tell us? And how might we gather information over time about words that students are mastering? So this work comes from chapter 6 in Bringing Words to Life. And when I was doing site visits in the fall, I saw that a lot of you had the bringing words to life in your work area, which was pretty fun. So this is chapter 6 about assessing and maintaining new vocabulary. So what kinds of assessments are appropriate for vocabulary? The first thing we have to think about is what level of understanding do we want students to have? What is our goal? Is our goal that they have a broad understanding of a set of words, or is our goal that we want them to have a deep understanding? So do we want them to have an initial, we call that an initial association to a word, meaning that they've heard the word before, they have a sense of the word, they could potentially use that word in a sentence? Or do we want them to really understand that word so that they can assist with comprehension and assist in their ability to write a composition? So that's the very first thing we think about with assessment. It isn't necessarily something that we do without giving that thought. Do I want to measure a broad understanding, or do I want to measure a deep understanding? Welcome to everybody who just joined. We are just getting started, and the topic for today is assessing vocabulary. Chapter 6 from Isabel Beck's book, Bringing Words to Life. So let's talk a little bit about multiple choice format. So a lot of you, and I know with ISIP and I know with iStation, a lot of times we use a multiple choice format. Even sometimes your unit assessments for your reading programs are in a multiple choice format. This is the most widely used format for assessing vocabulary. However, the distractors in a multiple choice format can really influence a student's performance. And if they don't know the word deeply, oftentimes the distractors can cause kids trouble. So you can use a multiple choice format to tap into different levels of word knowledge. If I were thinking about about a word, a question I could ask them is, the word blank has to do with, and then I have multiple choices underneath. That gives me a sense of, does the child have a semantic level understanding? Do they understand that word in relationship to a topic or relationship to other words? Or identifying the word definition. So if I'm going to use a multiple choice format, those are two ways that I can really get a good picture from a multiple choice format. However, a lot of researchers find drawbacks to the multiple choice format. And similar in terms of true or false, we can often get false positives or false negatives because we aren't really deeply measuring how well the students understand the word. So let's talk about, let me go back here for a second before we tap in. So if I'm going to do a multiple choice format, I may, the very first thing is which words are important, which words do students need to know. So a lot of times, the words that are in your reading material might not be the words that your students need to know. Maybe there are 3 or 4 words that have been chosen from your reading program for the week, but you know there are 3 or 4 or 5 other words that students need to know in order to comprehend the text. So one of the drawbacks about a multiple choice format within your reading program is that they measure the words that they determined at the beginning of the week were critical to know. And you may have students who already know 4 or 5 of those words really well, but there are other words you need to bring in. So a multiple choice format is tricky because it has already decided which of those words your students need to know. Another tricky item of multiple choice formats is that it usually measures on the surface level of what students might know in terms of a word. They may not know the shades of meaning with that word. They may not know the word relatives. They may know one version of the word, but they don't know the other versions of the word. So being able to measure deeply is pretty tricky in a multiple choice format. However, if the questions are correct, then you can get a little bit of a sense of that word. I'm going to skip this actually. I'm going to skip the chat box because I want to talk about a couple of these things, and I know our time's going to go by pretty quickly. There are some non-traditional formats that I really love for measuring vocabulary knowledge. And if I'm looking at delivering vocab instruction, and I'm responsible at the end of a week or 2 weeks or so to have vocabulary record, vocabulary scores, I want to take a look at how some non-traditional ways of looking at measuring vocabulary understanding. One would be an example or a non-example. If I give students a word and they can generate an example of that word or a non-example of that word, then I know they have a pretty good understanding. If they can generate both an example and non-example, then I know they have a deep understanding of that word because they can put parameters around that word of a non-example. And we'll look at these in just a minute. Another way that that Isabel Beck talks about measuring vocabulary is student created examples. So I give the students a word and they create an example related to that word. And then the last one is semantic knowledge. So let's take a look at these. This is an example, non-example. So you present items that ask students to distinguish between an example of the word or a non-example of the word. So I give them both an example and a non-example and ask them to distinguish between those. Or having them do an example and a non-example that have similar features so that students are really thinking about the target of the word. So let's look here at an example at the top. So the word is proclaim. An example would be, so it would be yes or no. Which one of these is the example? Which one is a non-example? A woman refuses to talk to reporters about the election. Is that an example or a non-example of the word proclaim? The next sentence, a woman tells reporters which candidate won the election. Example, non-example. So there are several things in these two sentences that are the same. The only thing that's really different is the part of the sentence that refers to the word proclaim. So a woman, there's a woman in both sentences. They are talking about an election and they are doing something with reporters. So those three pieces of the sentence are all the same. The difference is the part that holds the understanding of the word proclaim, refuses to talk or tells reporters. And the answer, of course, would be the second one. So then students have to determine which of them is the example, which of them is the non-example. Let's go down to the word commend. Your teacher tells you to have your parents come in for a, for a conference. Or your teacher tells your parents how well you are doing in school. Which one of these is the example? Which one of them is a non-example? And if I'm giving this for an assessment, all I have to do is have students write example, non-example by the prospective answer. So in commend, the teacher's the same, you are the same, your parents are the same. The commend part has to do with come in for or how well you are doing. And then last of all, mention. So our neighbors once told us that they had lived in Florida. Our neighbors are always talking about when they lived in Florida. This is pretty nuanced. So this would, a child would really have to think here. Mentioning is to briefly tell. So always talking about would be a non-example because it's always talking about, and once told would be a brief mention. So this is one example of how you could measure whether a student really understood this vocabulary word or not, because they are distinguishing between an example and a non-example. So will you just type into the chat box just for a moment on how you might think about this idea of example, non-example in terms of measuring vocabulary knowledge? Please just type into the chat box. What are you thinking about now that we've talked a little bit about example, non-example as one way to measure if students understand a word? Yes, that's great, Liz. Right, so once they get good at this and they understand what that means, they then can create their own. And that's way up in the taxonomy, right? Way up in terms of levels of complexity. This one that I showed you is the idea of can they distinguish? And then being able to write their own is really showing that they have full command of the word because they can generate their own. Love it. Providing words in, thank you, Liz. Providing the words and sentences would help a student be able to demonstrate their knowledge. Yes, doesn't it? Way better than having them do maybe a multiple choice here. They have to determine whether this is an example or not. Yeah, and I love that, Samantha, having them, it's one of the things we learned about having examples and non-examples when we are introducing words, right? That we give examples, we give non-examples, we pronounce the word, we give use it in a sentence, give examples, non-examples. Yeah, now we're using that very same part to measure the words. Beautiful. It gives us something to think about. The similarities in sentences really make them think. Yes, isn't that wonderful? I really love this. Number one, I love this strategy for teaching, but in looking at chapter 6, this is a really great strategy also for measuring vocabulary. Yeah, excellent. Very good. Let me see if there's one here I have missed. All right, beautiful job, everybody. Thank you. So let's take a look at another one. These are student created examples. So the word describe is the word that we're working on. So describe how someone acts that shows being diligent. So now they're using an example of the word, actually the word is diligent. So they're going to describe how someone acts when they're being diligent. The vocabulary word was diligent, sorry. The next one is tell about, another way you could prompt them, tell about a time that you were perplexed. So now students are creating an example of a time they were perplexed. And the last vocabulary word is miserable. So you can then go back, describe some things that could make a person feel miserable. You could also flip those to a non-example. Describe how someone acts that shows them not being diligent. Tell about a time that you were not perplexed. Describe some things that could make a person not feel miserable. So you could do it either way. I wouldn't mix them. I would have them generate all examples or have them generate all non-examples. I wouldn't necessarily mix them with kids because this is a really complex task. So this is one way that you, and I love the sharing in the chat box, this is one of the ways you could actually set that up for kids so that they could be very successful in generating their own. Here's another way. This is called semantic knowledge. And semantic knowledge is really about word relatives, the way that words relate to each other. Ask students to describe what is alike or different for a pair of words. This is another assessment tool that for me shows a really good understanding of a set of words. Berate and retort. So you have taught the words, you have introduced them, you have worked with them for a few days, maybe even a week. Now you're going to assess them and you give them the two words, berate, retort. How are they alike or how are they different? If I thoroughly understand both of those words, I am able to now describe what is similar or different. Exotic, unique. So now I understand both of those words. I can describe what is similar or what is different. So this one's tricky. This one's really hard. I like to do this with all kids, depending on the levels of words. I can change this assessment depending on the level of vocabulary words that I am providing for kids. So I can change the complexity of the words just by the two pairs that I present. So semantic knowledge. Let me go back here for a minute. Another way to measure is called a semantic array. And you put the two words, berate and retort, and then the students put all of the words in between. So you put two opposites, sorry. Berate, congratulate, and put all of the words in between that show semantic gradients. It's another way to use the semantic knowledge when you're measuring. So let's say we're going to measure vocabulary for young kids. That is a very tough thing to do in a traditional measure. So the teacher has taught the word, she's taught the word, or he has taught the word usual, he's taught the word drenched, we introduced it, we taught it all week. Now we are ready to measure, do they have an understanding? So the teacher presents the statements orally, and the students have a yes or no response card. So a couple of different ways. They have a little sheet that has word 1, word 2, word 3, a yes or a no, or a smiley face or a frowny face. And I say, boys and girls, here's your first word. The first word is usual. Here's your sentence. If something is usual, does it happen a lot? Color in your smiley face or color in your frowny face. If something is usual, does it happen a lot? Or circle your yes or circle your no. My next question, ready boys and girls? Here we go. Here's our next word. Does drenched mean very hungry? Color it in, circle yes or no. So this measuring vocabulary with young kids is super tough. I really love this way of having students respond. It is a semi-deep way. It is not having kids give examples or generating sentences. It is kind of a medium deep way of measuring. So just a thought for assessing young kids. All right. So another way to think about it, when students are taking multiple choice questions and when they're presented orally, it asks students to hold too much information in their working memory. So if you have multiple choice questions, a consideration is to flip them into a cluster of yes/no items. So this one would mean, so taking each of the responses and flipping them into a multiple choice question. If you are a whiz, and here's an example, if you are a whiz at working puzzles, might someone say that you are clever? Yes or no? They answer it. If you couldn't remember your phone number, might someone say that you are clever? Yes or no? And then the bottom two. The last two, so the first two items give an example of how that word is being used, and the bottom two examples focus on the meaning of the word. Does clever mean trying hard? Yes or no? Does clever mean good at figuring things out? Yes or no? So this is another way to think about taking the multiple choice questions that you have and flipping them into questions that could be answered in a yes or no format, or generating a set of questions that are clustered. And the key here is that they need to be able to answer yes or no. All right, so let's talk about just a bit more about that in the chat box. So can you share something so far that has been thought-provoking, interesting to you in terms of measuring vocabulary and thinking about it a little differently? So will you just chat in the chat box for a little bit? Really like the idea of a semantic gradient. Yep, exactly. Me too, Liz. It's one of my favorite ways to measure vocabulary, because if I know that they can put the gradients in, then I know they fully understand that vocabulary word. You know, Riverside, you are right about that. This technique will take much longer. And so you do need to scale back on the number of words that we assess, because if we go ahead and do this kind of deep measuring for all of the words, then we aren't able to have the assessment be in an amount of time that actually is reasonable, right? So that's why you really have to understand what it is you want to measure before you start. Do I want a broad measure of all of the words? If I do, I think I'll use this format. Maybe it even is a multiple choice format. Or do I want to know if they have a deep understanding of the 4 or 5 words that are really critical? Then I can move to this deeper level of understanding. So love that question. That's really great. Yes or no definitely simplifies the vocabulary and works really well for special ed. That's right, Samantha. For students where language is an area where they are working, we want to reduce the plethora of language and really focus on the word and the word in context or the word in the examples. And then their response is a yes, no. In a recorded format. Yeah, beautiful. Students enjoy created examples. Beautiful job. Will you please type into the chat box? Do you have your Bringing Words to Life book with you? Will you please type into the chat box? Deanna, we better get you a book if we don't have one. All right, Samantha, thank you. Is there anybody else who does have the book? All right, awesome. All right. No problem at all. No problem at all. So here's what I would say, and some yeses. Okay, here's what I would like. I think there will be some benefit still to have folks do a little bit of reading and then talking. So this section is maintaining attention to new words. So here's what we're going to do. Thank you, Moreland. We are going to work in a breakout room, and I'm going to put you in 4s. And here's what I would like you to do. Number 1s, and you have to number off really quickly. I really do want you to get a chance to look at this chapter. So number 1s, you're going to read the section on creating classroom reference resources. Number 2, you're going to work on incorporating words into new situations. And number 3, word wizard. And number 4 is the section in the media. So it is on page 109 to 115. So you have about a page, a little over a page that you're each going to read. So here's your first job. Your first job when you get into your breakout room is to quickly number off so that there are, there's a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. If you happen to be a person who doesn't have the book, then no worries at all. Just give it about 3 minutes and then your colleagues will be able to begin to share. So we have a few minutes for this activity. If you'll take about 5 minutes or so to read your section, and then you're going to talk about your piece. So will you just type into the chat box, yes, that you know what your job is, what your first job is, what your second job is when you get into the breakout room. Thanks, Riverside. All right, so let me say, number 1, as soon as you get in there, number off, 1, 2, 3, 4, that should take you 10 seconds. Then quietly read your section. You may need to take a picture of this or write down at least the first word of each of the sections so you can read them. Then you're going to talk about your section. So about 5 or 6 minutes to read. Even if you don't get your entire section finished, that's okay. At 6 minutes, I will send a note to you in the breakout room, and I'd like you to start to share about your work. Number 1s go first, number 2s, number 3s, and number 4. There's some really powerful things within this chapter. So we are looking forward to you having some time with your folks. All right. I will send you notes into your room. I may drop into your room and make sure you're all set and good to go. So let me just do a quick check. All right, thank you. All right, let me see, where's Rockford? Make sure you're in a good spot. All right, I think you're good. All right, very good. Have a good time, number off, read your section, and chat. All right, see you in a bit. All right, beautiful. Just about everybody is back. Awesome job. Hopefully you got some pieces of information that were helpful for you. Hopefully you had a chance to read each of those sections and talk about them a little bit. This book has a wealth of information. So will you type into the chat box maybe one thing that was helpful for you related to vocabulary and these sections, if you were talking about them, in your breakout room? Type out one idea or one piece that was thoughtful or helpful from your breakout room. Please type that into the chat box. Thank you so much for doing that, everybody. I see lots of typing. Thanks, everyone. Using Word Wizard is a great idea for getting kids involved, isn't it? I love Word Wizard and reading about it in that chapter. Beautiful. Being an active participant, excellent. Flexibility of the index cards, beautiful. Kids coming to school the next day with a new word that they learned, excellent. The word wizard, how you can involve students. Excellent. That's great. Use the word wizard for DOL. Beautiful. Excellent. Many of you are speaking about the word wizard. That had a pretty big impact. That's great. I'll wait about 30 more seconds for anyone typing one last comment. All right, beautiful job, beautiful job. Oh, one more, let me catch it really quickly. The idea of the index cards, I wonder how that could be implemented for the young ones. You know, Deanna, that's a really good, a good comment and consideration. How might we think about that? I'm guessing you'll give it a little bit of thought on how you might put that into play, maybe with symbols, with much less text. Yeah, I'm guessing you'll give it some thought. Excellent job. Beautiful work. So I'm going to just double check. Are there any comments or any questions? Our goal today was to really give you, Rose, let me talk back to your comment. I really love this. Use times like waiting in line for lunch to give a sentence or example or a differentiation between an example and a non-example. I love that we have moments throughout the day where if we are consciously aware, that we can build that word consciousness, build in that repetition, that cumulative review. Love that. If we're intentional about it and we're planful. We know that many of us teach students who don't necessarily come in with a strong academic vocabulary, and the more opportunity and reps they get for that cumulative review, the better. Yes, beautiful job. I just want to give a space for a minute. Are there any questions or further considerations? Beautiful sharing in the chat box. Yeah. Yes. Thank you for being here, everyone. Our goal with these calls is to just give bits of professional learning, time with your colleagues, time with colleagues across the state, anchoring it in the book. And with this cohort, it's bringing words to life, and then just adding to our understanding and our repertoire for vocabulary instruction and vocabulary measurement. Hopefully today, you have a couple of things you're thinking about in terms of measuring vocabulary instruction. A Frayer model, a graphic organizer, is a good teaching tool, but if you flip it, it's also a good measurement tool. So that's the thing with vocabulary, is that many of our instructional tools also can become measurement tools. They're not standardized, but it's very difficult to measure vocabulary in a standardized fashion. So these give us some other tools to think about in terms of knowing whether students really know the words. Beautiful job. If you will take just a minute today and fill out the attendance sheet, that would be fantastic, with the QR code and or the link. That would be wonderful. We really appreciate your time. We know that you work hard in your day and that you get on these trainings and that you've already taught a long day. So we're very appreciative of you and your time. Shelby and I are super excited to be heading out into the field. We start our site visits the last week of January, first week of February. So we're really excited to come back and spend time in your buildings. We look very forward to the time when we get there. So if there are any things you want to look at, talk about, spend time with, in particular, and especially with vocabulary, that would be fantastic. So if you will take a moment and do your attendance, that would be terrific. And